Yeah, Jana and me are gonna kick off talking about sort of the complex topic that is the value chain, that is Scope 3 emissions, and trying to make business sense of it. So how do you go about measuring your Scope 3 emissions? How do you go about thinking, setting a target, reducing your emissions? So that's really what we want to touch on today. So my name is Paula Schmidsfelden. I lead the Carbon Trust's work in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And yeah, for those of you who maybe don't know us that well, you can't really see the map, but that's what it's supposed to show. The Carbon Trust is a mission-driven organization. We're a mission-driven climate change consultancy, and that mission is to accelerate the move to a decarbonized future. So what we do is we try and support governments, multilateral organizations, but most importantly, businesses on their route to net zero. So as you can see, or as you should see on the map, we're fairly international. So we've got offices all over the globe. We've got a team of about 400 experts working for us. And we've been doing what we're doing today for over 20 years, which means we do know what works, we know what doesn't work, and most importantly, we know why. So what we want to touch on today is the big topic of Scope 3. So I'm sure all of you have been in touch with that to some extent, either through your own business or through your partners, through your suppliers, through your clients. And it's obviously a complex one. And we really want to tackle 3 questions today. So firstly, in order to manage your Scope 3, you need to understand it, you need to measure it. So how do you go about starting that process? How can you measure your Scope 3 emissions? Secondly, how do you then think about setting an ambitious, transparent reduction target? And finally, most importantly, how do you go about reducing? So how do you reach that target? How do you achieve your reductions? So these are the questions that we want to touch on today, obviously 3 big ones. Before we dive in, let's just spend a minute defining what we're talking about, the value chain. So Scope 3 is obviously what makes up the majority of most companies' businesses, what makes up the bulk of a footprint. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has defined 15 Scope 3 categories, which obviously sit next to Scope 1 and 2, which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with. So the direct and indirect emissions that are within your own organizational boundary that you do have a certain level of control over. So these 15 Scope 3 categories range from starting category 1, purchased goods and services, up to things like waste, business travel, or if we look downstream, things like the use phase or the end of life phase of products that you've sold. So how can you start thinking about measuring these? How can we start making sense of them? So as I've just said, for most of the businesses that we work with, Scope 3 makes up more than even 90% of their footprint. So it's really where things get interesting, but also really tricky. And best practice in order to calculate the emissions is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has issued a Scope 3 guidance, which was also co-authored by the Carbon Trust. And that really helps you with going about in terms of the methodology and how you should approach the calculation of it. So the need to measure it is really because, first of all, measuring your Scope 3 will help you understanding your hotspots. Where do my emissions come from? And secondly, it helps you prioritize your reduction measures. So how can you focus your efforts? And when you go about calculating these categories, the main thing really is when you start off, is to assess the materiality of these categories and focus where you can have the biggest influence. And that's also how you want to think about collecting data. So obviously all of these categories lie outside of your own direct control. So that's a huge effort that needs to go into data collection. And the more material a category, the more you should focus on getting primary data, activity data, that more accurate the data, the better. The less relevant the category, the more you can sort of work with spend-based models, work with secondary data, and there may even be categories that you can exclude completely. So for example, if you're not involved in any franchise business, category 14 is not relevant for you. So that's really what you need to think about when starting to measure a footprint. And I think the most important thing to recognize is when you embark on that journey of calculating your Scope 3 footprint is to recognize that it's an iterative process, that it's something that will improve over time. And it's really, really key to acknowledge that, not only to not go crazy in the process, but also to be able to prioritize your efforts, right? So just on that, usually when you start off with your Scope 3 footprint in your first year, there's still a very high range of uncertainty, right? You start off maybe with spend-based factors, with publicly available data, and the goal should be to improve that over time, right? So you maybe move to quantity-based factors that are still global averages, to then going to country-specific averages, with the goal of at some point having maybe supplier-specific emission factors that you can work with, at least for the key emission sources that you're facing. So that's important to note. So let's say we've got a baseline footprint. We're obviously browsing through an exercise that usually takes quite a bit of time and effort. How can you then start thinking about a target? How can you then set a target that's ambitious, that is transparent, that you can talk about? So best practice here by far is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the SBTI, which I'm sure all of you have heard of to some extent or are maybe already working on. And the Science-Based Targets Initiative provides you with guidance on how to calculate your target, how to go about thinking about a target. And put very simply, what they do is, in a first step, you look at what's the global budget, carbon budget that is still available in order to stay in line with 1.5 degrees of global warming or a net zero pathway. So what's the entire cake, the whole pie that we've got left? And then in a second step, with the help of the SBTI methodology, which makes sure that it's comparable, that every business uses the same approach, right? You then look at how much of that pie is mine. So which budget can be allocated to me? What's the slice? What's the pie that I can still, how much can I still emit, essentially? And then you compare that to the baseline footprint that you've calculated. And that gives you your gap, that shows you by how much you need to reduce. And that gives you your target, right? In order to be in line with net zero, in order to be in line with a 1.5 degrees pathway. And the SBTI really is best practice in terms of a framework for the private sector, and a framework that essentially is embedded into the latest climate science and in line with the Paris Agreement. And once that is calculated and once it's approved by the SBTI, that gives you something that you can comfortably talk about, something that is internationally comparable, and something that is also transparent, which is key, right? We talked about greenwashing, that's key. So what comes next? A lot of information in here. The key message is managing your Scope 3 emissions requires working on multiple work streams over time, right, at the same time. So we talked about footprinting here on the top, so getting an idea of where you're at with your emissions, developing that baseline. We talked about target setting. And now something else that most companies make use of, something else that can give you really valuable information, is something that we call a feasibility analysis or a feasibility assessment, where essentially you look at how feasible is it to achieve that target. So what you would do is you start looking at all of the reduction measures that you maybe have already identified, that you've planned, maybe already implemented. You look at these measures and you assess their reduction potential. So how much closer does this measure bring me to my target? And also, is there still a gap to my target? So what do I need to close here? How far am I off? So doing that analysis will help you, being confident about the target, and when talking about it, is this achievable for me? Where are we? And B, it also helps you prioritize. You won't be able to implement everything at once. So what you should really focus on in the first instance, where's the biggest impact? And then in the final step, here in green, it's obviously about implementing all of that. So thinking about how to action these reduction measures. So there's a few, obviously, that you can work on across your value chain. And we'll talk about these in a bit more detail. So supplier engagement being one, thinking about product innovation, circularity, and so on. So to give you a few illustrative examples, and when thinking about levers that you can pull in order to reduce your emissions in Scope 3. So again, these are illustrative. Which levers you can pull will obviously depend on the nature of your business. There's no sort of one size fits all, unfortunately, but there's a few levers that each and everyone can pull to some extent. So if we start off by looking at the downstream emission side, mostly when you're thinking about how to reduce your Scope 3 emissions, so how to reduce emissions that are not within your organizational boundary, that are not within your own direct control, it's things that would lie within the supply chain or within your product and service offering. So, for example, thinking about the category of use of sold products, maybe you can think about the energy efficiency of the products when they are in use. Maybe you do have some room to sort of influence the behavior of the end consumer. Maybe there's an enablement factor that we can think about. When you think about transports, logistics, what can you optimize there? When you think about end of life, is there maybe a recycling component, a circularity approach that you could look at? So all of these are levers that need to be assessed across various departments within your business. It's obviously something that will not only relate to the sustainability team, as I'm sure you're all very aware of. When we then look at the upstream side of things, what can you do there? So thinking about category 1, purchase goods and services, for most companies, this is a big, big topic. I know Jana will touch on it. So what can you do around, for example, if it's products that you're selling, product design, what is there in terms of circularity that you can think about? Again, transports, logistics, what can you optimize here? Is there collaboration that you might be able to harness? And then within upstream, for example, we also have business travel. We have the category employee commuting. So are there policies that you can implement to influence behaviors there? I'm sure the pandemic has taught all of us a lot on that side of things. But the most important thing on the upstream side is supplier collaboration. So working with your partners in your upstream value chain. And that's something that I want to spend some time talking about as sort of a last lever that you can pull, but a very important resort. So what do we mean by supplier engagement or supplier engagement programs? Essentially, a supplier engagement program has 2 objectives. Firstly, you want to improve your data. So we talked about calculating your Scope 3 footprint and building that baseline. And in order to improve that baseline, you have to think about that baseline is really your basis for all the decision making. So for the target setting, for identifying reduction measures. So getting it right is key, right? To at least to the extent that you can. So improving that data, getting access to primary data means you have to go and talk to your suppliers at some point. So that's the objective 1. And the second objective is, with better relationships, there is the potential for implementing reduction measures together across your supply chain, which obviously gives you more impact potential. And essentially, there's 3 key steps involved in these programs. So usually you start off with, in the first step, with sort of a prioritization activity where you look at your supplier pool, and you obviously, we have clients that work with tens of thousands of suppliers, so you can't go out and speak to all of them. So you try and prioritize, pick those that are maybe, thinking about your key suppliers, key materials, pick those where you expect hotspots. And then once you have that pool, you go out, you reach out to them, and you try and get that specific data. So you try to have access to more primary data, to more activity data from them, which then can feed back into your footprint, into your calculation, which then can improve your footprint. And in a third instance, getting back to my point before, you try and collaborate. You pick a few targeted suppliers where you have improved relationships in order to implement reduction measures, in order to collaborate across the supply chain and put these things into action together. And then obviously over time, the aim is to sort of extend that supplier pool and have more impact as you go on in subsequent years. So yeah, managing Scope 3 emissions is really multiple work streams. We've browsed through them, but on the left-hand side, footprinting, understanding what you're working with in order to manage it, setting a target, know where you're going, thinking about the feasibility of it, how can I achieve it, how much of that can I achieve today, what else do I need to identify, and then going about actually reducing it, which in most cases includes supplier engagement. Yes, I hope that was a helpful teaser to the big topic of Scope 3. I look forward to discussing it in more depth over the coming 2 days. And I'm glad that we have Jana here, A1 Telekom Austria, with some first-hand experience that she can share. So handing over to you.
Yep. I work in the ESG department and particularly focusing it's a small department, so on many topics, among other the supply chain management from the sustainability side, so our Scope 3 reduction, circular economy, our ESG reporting, and so on. First, Paula, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here with everyone. Yeah. Thank you. Before I start talking about our Scope 3 management, I'd just say a few words about A1 Telekom Austria. So we are a multinational company, European company, based with headquarters in Vienna, Austria, but we work in 7 countries. So apart from Austria, that will be Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, North Macedonia, Bulgaria, Belarus. This will be our core operations, where we have mobile and fixed operations, and also we have in Switzerland and Germany we operate with A1 Digital, which is our digital transformation services that we provide to clients to also help them optimize their energy use, for example. Our main owners are América Móvil, which is one of the top 10 largest global telcos, and also State of Austria. So in terms of our sustainability strategy, which I would like to kind of take in to bring you into the topic of Scope 3, this is our current sustainability strategy, where we are working on kind of developing and upgrading this strategy, which should be publicly available probably next year. However, this is what I can share. In terms of 2030, we have a CO2 emission reduction goal to reach carbon neutrality in own operations, if we can say so, which is backed up with our science-based target initiative. We have set that on all 3 scopes, and it's been approved on the 2019 basis to cut 50% emissions across all scopes. We also have targets on energy efficiency, so to raise energy efficiency, because it's not really just about how we manage carbon and get green energy, but also actually to reduce the demand for energy, so to cut that by 80% from 2019. We have targets in circular economy. For us, also major thing is digital education, and actually, because we are a telco operator, addiction to mobile device or any other device is quite possible, and we want to encourage and reach children and teach them about how to properly use devices and how not to get stuck in this world of tomorrow. And the targets in diversity, so to increase by 40% the number of employees and female managers in the company. So this kind of brings me into our energy information. So as you can see, our emissions in Scope 1 and 2 are relatively small when we compare them with the Scope 3. You can see that Scope 3 represents above 70% of our emissions, so possibly even more if we, when we upgrade our measuring, the way how we approach emissions. And for Scope 1 and 2, I put here business as usual, because we know what this is, we know how to measure this, we know how to tackle, we have a plan for green energy, energy efficiency, and it's communicated across the company. Everybody's aware and working on what we have, we call it the roadmap. Then Scope 3 comes into the picture, and it's something else. Paula was talking about these 15 categories, and this is how they look for us. When we started measuring Scope 3, we started using Quantis. And Quantis is quite a handy tool. I don't know if you know about it, but basically you put in your financial information, some information about Scope 1 and 2, and you get very quickly results that gives you, it's also approved by science-based targets, so it's quite legit to use it. And you get information about your emissions. So you see that most of our emissions, as Paula hinted, actually sit in category 1 and 2, purchase goods and services, and capital goods. And then we have some in the category 11, which is use of sold products. The one marked in red are the one that we've selected to reduce when we committed to science-based target reduction of 50%. And yeah, this was all approved by the science-based target. However, then it kind of hit us. What actually this means is that, okay, this is based on financial information. My goal is not to cut financial fines. We want to expand rather, and also green products will probably cost us more. So how do we, with this method, reduce our emissions by 50%? if we're using financial method. So obviously that can create a little bit of a panic and restructuring. So we have to reach out to see what are our other options. Look into back again the GEG methodology, what is it that they are looking at. So we looked at what is the best practice, how is industry managing this, and what are our peers doing to manage energy. So we had to kind of pick the battles. You saw what are our kind of top contributors to Scope 3, and that will be the purchase goods and services and capital goods. So let's focus on that, the first focus for this. How do we measure this again? So there are 3 approved methods by GEG. One is the financial method, which is the quantities, for example. The other one is hybrid method, which we focus, and I'll explain how it works for us. And the third method is to use something like an LCA, so it's very detailed. So we chose this hybrid model, and hybrid model because we are, I don't know, maybe it's not applicable for every industry, but for us it works relatively well. Hybrid model helps us focus on our suppliers. So look really who are our major vendors, where do we source our goods, and what are they doing? So how much our spend contributes to their revenue, and we create some proportion to see where do their main emissions come from, or our main emissions come from, because our emissions can only be proportion of our vendor emissions. So in this way, we got to pick who are the largest vendors, where the emissions. What I put here is a free ride. I don't really mean a free ride, but like as much as we are working on decarbonizing ourselves, our vendors, at least the more active ones, which we have a lot, are also working on decarbonizing themselves. So can we first analyze where we will be if we leave it as it is, like a business as usual scenario? Where will this method take us with our vendors? And for example, for these 3 years that we followed, okay, the vendors are taking us to some reduction. Where is it that we have to be? And then what next from there? So this is where the real piece of work comes for us. So how to decarbonize further. What doesn't help as well, or helps the planet, but makes our work harder, is that also the standards are changing. So now the next SBTi commitment that we will have to make will be the 90%, not anymore 50% reduction in Scope 3, or actually net zero commitment, which will include going zero across all scopes. So this will also require us to push even further our vendors and work with our vendors. Actually, there will be need for further certification, so for stronger verifications of what you're actually doing and how we are managing scopes. And there is a lot of legislative push, but also push by industries. So what we are then doing is looking what we can do. So what are our levers here? First step is really look deep in our supply chain. So with this hybrid model, what we've discovered who are our core suppliers, what are their emissions, but there is a big portion of our suppliers that can't be really tackled at the moment with this method, because they're simply not reporting data. So the second approach we're having next to the hybrid model is actually then going through our supply chain, mapping the materials that we're having, what are the core that fit into purchase goods and services, who are the vendors, which geographies we are covering. And in the first phase of this scheme, we're focusing on top 80 vendors in Austria, where we want to work and collaborate with them. At the first stage, we're sending a questionnaire and asking them to follow up and give us information on their carbon. But at the second stage, we also need to see how to motivate them to provide us this information, because we expect that a lot of these companies won't be able to at first hand respond to us. So what do we want to do? How do we want to react to this, and what is our plan? So big things for us will be finding an online reporting tool that can support us, possibly relying on Kovandzic, that is a good platform for reaching suppliers. We are using also a platform called Evalua, which is a platform for managing vendors and vendor relations. However, through this platform, you can create all sorts of questionnaires that can go at any point to a vendor. And one of these will be the one that will be focusing on emissions. Then the next one will be looking into conflict minerals and so on. So really looking deep into the supply chain. The next big thing for us is really industry collaboration. And telecom proves to be really cool industry with a lot of companies that are willing to collaborate on a common goal. So we have a lot of exchange sessions with all of them. Some of them are really in person, one-on-one. They're telling us their best experiences that we are sharing and asking the questions that are also bothering one and the other. We work also within the association. So there is a GSMA, which is covering telco operators. With GSMA, we are working commonly on creating Scope 3 guidance that is relevant for our industry. So really help each other and help all telcos to understand how to manage and report on Scope 3. Then we have the other thing that is very cool for us. We just joined JAC. JAC is called, it's a joint audit cooperation, and it's really only for telcos, where the goal is not just to measure our emissions, but actually work with suppliers. So at first, as it's called, joint audit cooperation, the idea is that every telco audits 5 suppliers a year. We are 25 telcos, so 125 suppliers a year will be audited with all, corrective actions. But then what is cool about the organization is it doesn't stop at auditing and telling our factories that we depend on, hey, you're the bad guys. The idea is that we also provide them education and material, so clear expectations. What is it that we want from them? How do we want that? And also, how should they do this? So really work with them and collaborate to achieve this common goal. And then the final thing is also look into certifications and verification. So have stronger verification of what we do, look really beyond audits, and look how to actually close the gaps and create corrective actions with everybody. And then just to, I think, wrap up, I think it's probably time to wrap up my part, is what we've learned and what we still need to learn. I guess this is, I think for me, how I see it is that Scope 3 management is really key to achieving sustainability. This because it's beyond our value chain, beyond our own operations, our value chain that sits somewhere in China, and we can say and pretend that we've done so much here, but there in these factories, we are responsible for what's also going on there. So working with our vendors, working with our supply chains, this is really key, and everything comes in connected. It is not just about the emissions, it is also about human rights, labor rights in these operations, about biodiversity and the topics that go beyond carbon. So we need to really raise awareness, we need to do this internally and externally. So at us, at the moment, is really upskilling of everybody to be on the same level, competent to talk about Scope 3 in the way that they are able to talk about Scope 1 and 2, and they really are in our company. So this is like a major educational step for us internally, but also then externally, really reaching out to our vendors. For me, it's also important to think about the social component of everything. So when we get into this Scope 3 management, there's going to be a lot of decisions based on better or more efficient companies. So it's important really to also think about little companies and make sure that this doesn't create unfair world where only big corporations operate, but also there is space for everybody. In this way, kind of give helping hand to small ones to also join and change their businesses and core of their businesses. And the last, maybe but not least, is always to try to think about when we are replacing one technology with something else and we think that we are doing a good thing, to really try to think what would be the consequences of our actions now. So we do solar, but what about lithium? We do wind turbines, but they create blades that are waste. What do we have? What is our backup, and how do we look into? So invest a lot also in technologies. In later, I would really like to hear what are your challenges about Scope 3 management. So if you'll have time or interest, please approach me to talk about it. And I would wrap up my part. I would say yesterday there was a really neat event in Vienna where we had Erin Brockovich speak to us, not Julia Roberts, but Erin Brockovich. And she said something really cool. She said the storm is coming. So the thing that you have to do is have a plan and be prepared until that storm is gone. That really struck me because this is what it is. You might think that we will meet 2050 or might not meet 2050, but we still have to work on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula.